Hello everyone, thank you for attending this webinar delivered by myself, Adam Ferry, one of the directors of the OT service for Closomat. We've delivered a large number of webinars for Closomat now through a range of topics, and there's a couple of others that I reference within this presentation where if you want to find out more information about something that's more specific, you can go onto the Closomat website or onto their YouTube channel and find out some of that information in a bit more depth, because what I don't want to do is use this time to regurgitate things that you might have already heard if you've already been on previous webinars. But this one, as you can see, is supporting the person with dementia through housing design. And what I've tried to do is make this a reflection of my experience. Your experiences might be different, and that's absolutely fine. But this is a reflection of mine. Some of the things that we talk about are transferable across a number of clinical areas, whether it be dementia or not, and I try and reference some of those as well. There's a bit of a refresher at the beginning, because obviously I can't tell who's attending this and what kind of experience you have. And hopefully there's at least just a couple of pointers you can take away at the end and reflect on how you might implement them in practice. I hope that's okay. So what we're going to do is develop a greater understanding of dementia or dementias, as the case is, and their impact on occupational performance. We're going to consider the impact of the environment and the evidence base for home modifications. We're going to link those recommendations to DFG legislation, determining eligibility for funding. I think that's really important. It's all well and good me sitting here and talking about what we can do for dementia, but we need to understand the reality of what we can or can't do based on the legislation. And we're going to reflect on how we support those people who don't receive funding support. So when we're looking at modifications for someone with dementia, what are our goals? What is it we're trying to achieve? And I'm sure you could come up with more. These are the three that I've put in that I think are probably the most important or most relevant. And that's to improve quality of life, to enhance safety and independence, and to facilitate caregiver support. So to support people who are looking after someone with dementia, if that's the case. So what is dementia? And this is the bit that I talked about very briefly when we first started about providing an overview, because I don't know who's listening and what their knowledge is. I've also put it in because I don't know about yourselves, but if you do have a greater understanding of dementia or dementias, the number of times in the media you hear the word dementia used, and they're clearly referring to something specific, but without saying specifically what kind of dementia that person had. It can sometimes be a little bit frustrating because they can present very differently. So as a starting point, done a reflection or a refresh on what dementia is and what the impact on occupational performance may be. So dementia is a group of symptoms that affect memory, processing of information, thought processes and cognition generally, and social abilities, not otherwise caused by neurological trauma. It's not a specific disease, but rather a general term for the impaired ability to remember, think, or make decisions that interferes with doing everyday activities. So it's just remembering that dementia itself is an umbrella term. So some of the types of dementia, and there are more, but I've put on some of the most common, as well as another group that you may or may not be familiar with. So we've got Alzheimer's dementia, we've got vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal mixed dementia, and posterior cortical atrophy. We're going to go into a little bit more depth about what they all are, how they present, and how they might impact on occupational performance. So Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. It affects 1 in 14 over 65s and 1 in 6 people over the age of 80. It's caused by a buildup of proteins in the brain. It's usually slowly degenerative and not life-shortening. So Alzheimer's wouldn't necessarily be a cause of death or would shorten the person's life. Anyone who's come into contact with someone with Alzheimer's will understand that it generally starts with some issues with short-term memory, which then grow and build into something that has much bigger impact on ability to risk assess, problem solve, process information. But like I say, it's more slowly degenerative and doesn't shorten life. Vascular dementia is caused by damaged or diseased blood vessels that supply blood to the brain. It's slightly more common in men, people from South Asia and African Caribbean backgrounds. Strong links to lifestyle, so diet, alcohol, smoking, exercise, or lack of. So the sorts of things that you might also associate with stroke, heart disease, anything that's to do with the vascular system within the body, then also affects the vascular system within the brain, and that tends to be what would then lead to a vascular dementia. Now, one of the big differences with vascular dementia, it's often more rapidly progressing than Alzheimer's, and can and often does shorten life. It can lead to other vascular presentations or diagnosis like stroke, heart disease, which then in turn shorten life. And it's that more rapidly progressing nature of vascular disease that has a big impact on the lives of carers, or on the assessment of healthcare professionals, maybe when we're thinking about future proofing, which we'll come on to later. Lewy body dementia is progressive, complex, and can be a very challenging condition. It accounts for 10 to 15% of dementia diagnoses. It's about the presence of Lewy body plaques, which are closely linked to Parkinson's. And this is one of the areas where I would encourage you to go and explore the presentation we did recently, the webinar we did recently for Closomat on Parkinson's and design, which will be on the Closomat YouTube channel, where I talk in much more depth about Lewy body and the difference between Lewy body and Parkinson's, and indeed Parkinsonism, but it does have close links. More unique to Lewy body dementia are symptoms such as hallucinations. So that could be visual, it could be auditory, sleep disturbance, and visual perception. Those things are much more associated with Lewy body than any other dementia. As you would find potentially with someone like Parkinson's. So if somebody had Parkinson's and dementia, chances are they talk about Parkinson's associated dementia or Parkinsonism and relate it to dementia. Somebody without Parkinson's disease with these symptoms and with these Lewy body plaques in certain areas of the brain would have a Lewy body dementia, but some of the symptoms can be very similar. But it's quite rapidly progressive in comparison to other dementias. Frontotemporal dementias are again another umbrella term for a group of dementias that affect the frontal and temporal lobes of the brain, and they're responsible for personality, behavior, language, and speech. They include things like progressive supranuclear palsy, primary progressive aphasia, and corticobasal degeneration, which I've abbreviated in the slides for obvious reasons. So if you've come across any of those specific diagnoses, then they're part of the group of frontotemporal dementias. Memory loss is less evident in the early stages of these dementias, which means they're often discovered or diagnosed much later. And they constitute 5% of all dementia diagnoses, which doesn't sound a lot, but actually for dementias that are quite complex and have a huge impact on behavior, social behavior, behaviors that challenge speech and language, ability to communicate. I actually was surprised that it was 5%. I thought it would be a bit less than that. But again, very different presentations, so very different things that as occupational therapists or as housing officers or grants officers that we need to be aware of in terms of either assessing for, making recommendations for, or approving those adaptations for. And that's really why I've put that why is a diagnosis important slide in. As occupational therapists, we clearly work within a social model, not a medical model. So we often talk about the diagnosis not being the most important thing. It's how the person presents. It's how we we apply an activity analysis to determine their challenges or their strengths. But clearly, a diagnosis for anything is still important. It provides us with the evidence base for whether the diagnosis or disease is going to be progressive, how rapidly progressing, what presentations are we likely to see in the future. Those sorts of things are really important for us to be able to understand what recommendations we should make, how we could reduce or minimize risk, how we can continue to support care providers or carers moving forward. So as much as it isn't necessarily the absolute critical element, it's really important that we have a level of understanding into the diagnosis for dementia, but as well as anything else. The reason why I think it's just as important, if not more important for dementia, is that if somebody has a diagnosis of dementia, you often see that written as dementia. But then we can challenge and investigate, well, what type of dementia? Because actually that has a big impact on, or it can potentially have a big impact on what we recommend and why, how we justify it, how we talk about the return on the investment, that adaptation, or that bit of equipment. How do we educate the person or their carers to be able to support that person now and in the future. So the principles of dementia design, I think, on my reflection, are around safety orientation, independence, and comfort. For safety, I think that's around preventing falls and injuries. So that's one of those areas that I'll talk about that isn't unique to someone with dementia, but where there are some specific things that we can do to reduce the risk or improve safety for falls for someone with dementia for very specific reasons. And again, within safety, the second element would be to ensure that the environment is secure. We're going to go into these in more depth. I'm just setting the scene. Orientation, about the person understanding their surroundings and therefore their ability to engage with their environment in a functional, occupational way. Independence, to encourage self-reliance, which then impacts on caregiver strain. And comfort, to create a home-like atmosphere, so maintaining the routines and the domestic environment wherever possible, and to support the person's physical and emotional well-being. I'm going to come on to those in much more depth. So safety within the design elements. So flooring. So as a starting point, if we're thinking about bathroom design specifically, it's ensuring that we understand safety flooring and categories and what that means. So I would always recommend that we're looking at Class C or R10 flooring. So Class C being where it's tested on barefoot and soap type substances. That testing is done on certain inclines or declines in those conditions to see at what point they become high risk. So Class C is what we would see as the standard for barefoot and soap within a domestic environment. R10 is traditionally it's more industry testing, so it's footwear and oil or emollient testing. But if you consider a carer who might be in that bathroom environment, might have something on their feet, and is using soap or maybe some sort of emollient for the person's skin, R10 is a good gauge for safety flooring in that, yes, it's industry tested, but it isn't so abrasive that it would have an impact on the person who is also barefoot. Once you get into R11 and above, they're much rougher floor surfaces and not appropriate for domestic environments for someone with barefoot. But just understand what classifications of flooring are, and then consider what the person's risks are. In other areas of the environment of the house, it's considering things like color contrast. How are you creating space that flows. So for example, someone with Lewy body dementia, even though they don't necessarily have Parkinson's, some of those Parkinson's symptoms can be very similar. So you can still get some freezing in threshes, in thresholds. So flooring that flows through the floor, whether it be ground floor or first floor, as much as possible, then alleviates some of those issues. And then wherever you're reducing some of those freezes, you're also reducing your falls risks. It's flooring, ideally, that isn't too dark, or where someone with a visual spatial deficit could determine it to be holes in the flooring. It's just thinking a bit more in a bit more depth and detail about what type of flooring is the most suitable. And I'm going to come on to color contrast a little bit later, which will also help with that. Heating, we generally recommend low surface heating. You can get some excellent kind of low level radiators that are often built into the skirting boards now, or underfloor heating, which is often used in bathrooms. If you're using towel rails, just think about what temperature they're set to from a thermostat perspective. Anywhere where you can hide high temperature surfaces is better. Just remember that if you're using underfloor heating, it'd be really useful from a future-proofing perspective to have a map of where that is, where it's laid, so that if in the future you're recommending something that's floor fixed, you're aware of where that is going to be safe to apply without damaging that underfloor heating. Lighting, it's obvious that something should be well lit, but it's what does well lit mean? Task lighting is something that we are really keen on, and there's a lot of evidence base for in terms of reducing falls, particularly in bathroom spaces. So it's thinking about, there's a lot of evidence around what lumens should be used, what the light width should be within that space. But really it's around lighting the object of the space rather than the whole room. And the research suggests that halving the distance between the light and the object increases visual acuity threefold. Is really good for someone with some sort of visual impairment as well. And there's a lot more information on lighting and task lighting and other presentations that we've delivered for Closomat, so take a look, particularly the one around visual impairment and housing design. Thoroughfares, making sure that they're not cluttered, but at the same time that the person is familiar with them. As soon as we start moving lots of furniture around and the person becomes less familiar with their environment with dementia, we increase the risks. And security, I've put that in because sometimes one of the things that gets missed, particularly if the person has care or lives with someone, is how we continue to maintain their independence and doing things like letting people into the house safely. What kind of systems are we using for that? Is the access well lit so the person can see through a window to see who's there? And if we're not, if somebody is less ambulant and we're using other kind of access systems, how are we doing that in a way that enables the person with the dementia who may have some issues with processing information? How are we doing that safely rather than necessarily going straight to that key safe option, maybe where the person is able to somebody is able to let themselves in and is often seen as a sign of disability from a public highway. It's just paying a bit more attention to it. Orientation, so signage. So there's some really good examples of how signage is used. I'll come on to briefly in a couple of case studies later. There's also some really bad examples of how signage is used. So think about using pictures and symbols rather than words. And if you use, or however works best for that person, just make it really clear what instruction is being given or what a space or a room is used for if the person needs it. Color contrast. So Ideally, you want to be thinking about spaces that have light reflective value of greater than 30. So whether that be the floor to the walls, or whether that be individual walls, if you're creating spaces to landmark, which is the next point. It really makes a big difference in identifying that space and what it's used for. So it could be wall to floor. So you're clearly identifying the space that the person has to work in, but also use color contrast to make things on the wall jump out. So things like grab rails, things like toilet seats, those sorts of things. Consider light reflective value and think, how do I create LRV of greater than 30 to make that space really, really jump? And landmarking, again, which is the next point, is also think of how color contrast picks out particular points within that space. So can the shower area be marked in a different color that has a light reflective value greater than 30? So it really highlights that space. Hospitals are getting much better at doing that, but maybe we're not quite so good at doing it in domestic spaces. And routine, it's really important that as much as we're making adaptations or recommending adaptations within these spaces, we're maintaining the person's normal routine as much as possible. This is a client group who aren't necessarily going to be able to adapt to change or process the new information they're being provided. So the more normal for them that we can create and keep, the better, whilst remembering that my normal isn't the same as theirs. So we really need to get to know how the person uses space. Independence, so accessibility, we use the term accessibility a lot, but what does it actually mean? Thinking about accessibility from not just how to access the room, but actually how is the room used when the person's in it. And that's every single element of the room and the space. Does the person prefer a shower or a bath? I could provide a whole presentation in this about bathing as a meaningful occupation. But it could be the person just prefers showering, and that's absolutely fine. But there's no reason why someone with a dementia can't bathe if they've always felt that it's meaningful to them. It's just thinking about that individual risk assessment and how that's done safely. Controls, what controls are being used for things like wash, dry, toilet, shower, bath. What's the signage on them? Are they complicated or not? Are they two button? Are they not? Have they got very clear indicators on those buttons about what and how they should be used? There's some brilliant shower designs that are dementia approved that have very clear signage on them using colors in a very clever way as well, to help the person with dementia understand what they're using in a very basic way. Screens and curtains is a really interesting one. There's always a bit of debate. We recently internally had a discussion about half-height screens, and maybe we should reflect on what their purpose is and how they're used. But again, it's very much around, what does the person have carer support? Think a bit more critically about whether screens or curtains are going to be the right thing for that person and for the carers. What is it we're trying to avoid or protect in using them? Do they need them at all? Can they just be open spaces if it's a wet room that we're designing, because that gives better access and we don't need to worry quite so much about spray and water spillage? Water management, I think, is something that's often under-investigated. I'm thinking things like we often have isolators, or we might think about isolators or level indicators. So someone can run a bath and it sends an alarm if it's going to overflow, for example. But actually, there's a great stopcock switch as well from Sure Stop that I tend to recommend in all of my designs where there's water. So even in the kitchen or bathroom, it's a very accessible switch, which is just like a light switch, but means that water can be immediately accessible or not accessible if water is something that's causing a problem. Even with children, moving away from dementia, children who might have an obsession with water and water flow, it can be isolated very quickly. So it's a way of supporting the person to be independent whilst also managing risk. The toilet, is there a way of the person being able to be clean and dry without needing that carer support? So we're maximizing independence and dignity. Is something like a wash-dry toilet going to enable the person with the right controls? So someone like Closomat provide a wide range of controls for the person to be able to use the wash-dry facility that are compatible for somebody who may have some issues with processing, but aren't complicated at all, kind of single push buttons that do everything they need to be able to do, maintaining independence and dignity. And basics like open shelving, as soon as we put cupboards in with doors on, the person has to think or what's in them. So you're either going to have to use good signage to indicate what's in them, or just have open shelving, have things very clear so that the person doesn't have to think. It's there. It's part of that routine and part of that process. And comfort is a really important element. So comfort, I could have put aesthetic as well as the title. So things have to be functional. They have to maximize safety. They have to maximize independence, but the person has to like them. And I think that's where, as occupational therapists, sometimes we forget that need, want, and expectation as part of our role. So the space can be personalized, and it can still form into a basic design like a DocM design, but it can still be personalized using things like color. The person is not going to use a space that they don't like. Are the aesthetics familiar to them? So again, this goes back to not making wholesale changes if they're not necessary. And even if we are making big adaptation changes, it's trying to keep the aesthetic as much to the person's likes, desires, familiarities as is possible. They're much more likely to use that space safely and independently, and therefore with dignity, if we're taking all of that into consideration. And their sensory needs. Someone I know well, and we deliver moving and handling training with, Deb Harrison at A1 Risk, often talks about an example of where she supported somebody who was being distressed when they were being hoisted, and the carers just couldn't kind of work out why that was. And this person had a vascular dementia. So Deb was hoisted up in this sling, and it became very clear that the wallpaper at the end of the room the person was looking at, and how the process was being done, was having a significant impact on their proprioception. And that was what ended up causing the distress. And I think it's us thinking more carefully, especially with someone like a vascular and definitely Lewy body dementia, about what their sensory needs are in that space. How do we reduce echo? How do we reduce shadowing? How do we make it a more comfortable space for them, and consider all the elements of that and put it all together in one design? Technology and innovation is something that's become much more prevalent in design. I'm going to talk about it in terms of DFG very shortly. But again, it's thinking about how do we use technology for someone with dementia. I'm going to not go into it in depth in this slide. I'm just setting the scene for it as part of, and again, and justify it as part of design that maximizes independence, maximizes safety, provides dignity, supports carers, and provides a good return on investment. And there's some really good case studies if you want to have a look at them in more depth. I talked about signage, things like that picture on the right there. It makes it incredibly clear what that space is. And if you look, they've used black and yellow for their signage, and black and yellow are at the complete different ends of the light reflective value spectrum. It's why a lot of warning signs are in yellow and black, because the black jumps out. So it's an example of signage, but also an example of light reflective value and color contrast. The three examples that I've put on there are really good examples of how residential environments have created spaces that provide comfort whilst providing functionality, reducing risk and dignity. So where there are outdoor spaces where people can use an allotment, have their own allotment space, where you can see in the picture there, this guy can go and sit in his garden shed and it feel much more like home. Where there are restaurants, bars, coffee shops within the care home to try and provide that more domestic routine space. Definitely worth having a look at in more depth to provide you with more evidence of what's worked in the past. And some excellent resources. So the DFG grant delivery guides for local authorities in England, written in conjunction with foundations. If you don't have a copy, get a hold of one. It's excellent in terms of how to apply recommendations to DFG for funding, and the Environment for Aging and Dementia Design Assessment Tool from the University of Stirling. Two excellent resources to be able to look at and help you move forward. So the application of the legislation. So obviously I'm talking about DFG here. I've put a few points on just based on my experience, how we can use our recommendations and apply them. But the starting point being, I often think that having reviewed a lot of reports and provided a lot of supervision across the UK, we jump to a determination of necessary and appropriate before clarifying to ourselves that does it meet one of the 9 purposes. So identify which of the 9 purposes it meets, and then determine if the recommendation is necessary and appropriate, whilst remembering that if it doesn't meet that criteria, so if it doesn't meet any of the 9 purposes, or it does, but you don't think it's necessary and appropriate, not meeting it doesn't absolve social care of responsibility. It just means you can't use DFG. Assistive technologies such as environmental controls, so this is from a dementia context, environmental controls, smart hubs, height adjustable workstations, infrared power sockets, automated light switches, digital connectivity, so that's even improving somebody's ability to access Wi-Fi, using Alexas, etc. They're all technologies that are available to be supported through DFG if part of a capital expense. And the document that I talked to you about, the foundations document, gives much more depth about capital expense and how they would be approved or not through DFG. It's also worth recommending, though, again, if those things aren't going to be approved through DFG, or because of the timescales of DFG, use of assistive technology and approval for assistive technology can and often is part of your RRO. So where something that's going to maximize dignity, reduce independence, and reduce care need up to a certain value, if that sits within that RRO, there's no need for you to go use DFG funding or a DFG application to approve or to install some of those things. Future-proofing in DFG, I think it's really important for us to briefly cover future-proofing because of the degenerative nature of dementias, and it's often something that personally I struggle with DFG in terms of thinking about how do I justify this when it's something that might happen. Well, firstly, somebody with a dementia diagnosis immediately meets the disability criteria for DFG, so that isn't an issue. And the fact that the conditions are all degenerative, again, means that we can consider future-proofing. It's about, and I think it's about how we identify cost effectiveness and ROI, which is return on investment. And I think that's something as occupational therapists, certainly we could be a lot better at, because we're not necessarily business people. We're not necessarily economists or financiers. It's it's our understanding of money. Think carefully about how you demonstrate cost effectiveness and return on investment. And at last year's 2023's OT show, we delivered a presentation for Closomat on cost effectiveness and home adaptations, which will be on their website or is available if you contact Closomat. So there's much more depth in that full presentation around cost effectiveness, return on investment, home modifications and how we might use that information as an evidence base to get something approved. But future-proofing recommendations are certainly available through the DFG grant. And then finally, how do we support those who are self-funding? And this is just probably a little personal bugbear, is that often when we're doing work and we're supporting local authorities, whether it be through waiting list initiatives or anything else, is that often because of resources, and I understand it, because of resources, somebody who screens out as getting financial support, funding through DFG as part of their means testing, is then left to then just sort that themselves. And that's why I alluded to that responsibility through social care and absolving ourselves of responsibility just because somebody doesn't necessarily go through the DFG process. We need to remember that even though it might be because of resources, it shouldn't be the case. We still have a role there to support that person in making sure that the adaptations that they pay for meet their needs now and in the future. Otherwise, that's going to come back to social care as a future cost. So also worth remembering that just because the person might be self-funding this time, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't go through a DFG application, even if it's going to be a nil award, because that award, that what they're paying for this time might be offset against a future adaptation. And for conditions under the dementia umbrella, which are degenerative, the chances of that person needing future adaptations is fairly likely, particularly if it's something like an Alzheimer's, where it won't shorten life, but will continue to progress. So again, something just to bear in mind when we're going through that process for someone with dementia. So in summary, we've discussed dementias and their impact on occupational performance. We've considered the impact of the environment and the evidence base, some of the evidence base for home modifications. We've linked some recommendations to DFG legislation, reflecting on eligibility for funding, and we've very briefly touched on how to support those who do not receive funding support through DFG. This is an absolute whistle-stop tour in the time that we have. It's really, the aim of this is to plant some seeds, give you something to reflect on, and there are other presentations that were delivered at Closomat, like I say, where some of those specific things have been covered in more depth. So I would really encourage you to go onto the YouTube channel, contact Closomat, have a look at their website and see what else that we've delivered. Things like light reflected value, color contrast, falls, Parkinson's and Parkinsonism. All those kind of areas are covered with their own presentations in much more depth. So I hope this has planted a seed at least, and there's been something for you to reflect on. And I'm looking forward to taking any questions further. Thank you.